Chapter 1: The Navel of the World, Cuzco at Dusk. Cuzco, the name comes from the Quechua word, sometimes rendered as navel, sometimes as foundation stone, the pivot point around which all else turns. The Inca believed this city was the literal center of the world, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. They arranged their empire around it the way you arrange spokes around the hub of a wheel, and the hub, for them, was this high valley in the Peruvian Andes, roughly 3,400 meters above the sea. The city, at the height of the empire, may have held as many as 150,000 people. Some estimates are lower. Populations at altitude in pre-Columbian cities are difficult to calculate, but the image that comes down to us through the accounts of Spanish chroniclers and through the archaeology that has slowly, carefully been uncovering what lies beneath colonial Cuzco is of a city that was genuinely vast, genuinely prosperous, and genuinely unlike anything the arriving Europeans had ever seen. The city was shaped like a puma. This was not accidental. The Inca planned it that way. The puma was a symbol of royal power and earthly authority, one of the three sacred animals at the heart of Andean cosmology, along with the condor of and the serpent of. The fortress complex at the northern edge of the city formed the puma's head. Its massive zigzag walls, built from stones so large that European observers could not believe they had been moved without heavy machinery, formed the puma's teeth, bared toward the sky. The body of the city, its temples, its plazas, its royal compounds stretched southward toward the tail, which was the Temple of the Sun, the most sacred building in the empire. To plan a city in the shape of a sacred animal is to say something fundamental about what a city is, not merely a settlement, not merely a concentration of people and resources, but a manifestation of something larger. Cuzco, in its puma shape, was the body of the empire made visible in stone. Walking its streets was, in a real sense, walking inside a sacred form. Now, in the last light of evening, the city is settling into its nighttime self. The great plaza, what the Spanish would later call the plaza, is mostly empty. During the day, it was the heart of the city's public life, the place where the Inca made his appearances, where festivals unfolded, where flowed in quantities that still impress scholars reading the accounts. But the sun has set, and the plaza has quieted. The food sellers who set up their reed mats in the morning and sold roasted corn and dried fish and stewed potatoes are gone home. The administrators and messengers and petitioners who moved through the streets in their hundreds are retreating to their neighborhoods. But the city is not silent, not quite. You can smell it before you can see it, the torches. Resinous wood burning in iron brackets mounted in the stone walls of important buildings. The smoke drifts in the thin air, fragrant and a little oily. The priests of the are performing their evening circuits along the lines, the 41 invisible rays that radiated outward from the temple in every direction, passing through 328 sacred sites across the landscape. Every day, priests walked specific lines, making offerings at specific natural sacred sites, stones and springs and hills imbued with spiritual presence. In the evening, the smaller circuits were completed before full dark. The streets of Cuzco were narrow and straight, paved with fitted stone, channeled down the middle for drainage. The buildings on either side were made of stone, precisely cut, with that characteristic Inca fit that required no mortar, each stone shaped to sit perfectly against its neighbors. The walls sloped slightly inward as they rose, which is part of why so many of them are still standing today, having survived multiple earthquakes that toppled the Spanish colonial buildings built on top of them. In the residences of the nobility, torches burn in interior courtyards. Servants bring trays of food, meat on this occasion, camelid and possibly duck, for the nobility did not eat as the commoners ate. There are ceramic vessels and there are smaller vessels of plain water, and there is the smell of burning copal resin, the aromatic incense that the Inca used in ritual contexts, a smell that means proximity to the sacred, a smell that means that here the boundary between the ordinary world and the world of the gods is a little thinner. Somewhere in the city, a conch shell trumpet sounds, a brief, resonant note that carries surprisingly far in the thin air. It marks the change of watch at one of the temple precincts. The sound fades. The wind moves through the streets, carrying a little dust, carrying the cold that always comes down from the peaks after dark at this altitude. The city is not sleeping, not yet, but it is turning inward, the way cities everywhere have always turned inward when the light fails, withdrawing from the streets into the warmth of walls and fire. You follow a narrow stone path away from the central plaza, uphill, toward the residential neighborhoods where the ordinary citizens of Cusco live. And from there, in your imagination, you travel further down the mountain, out into the countryside, to the villages where the majority of the empire's people actually spent their nights. Chapter 2: Stone and Thatch: How Ordinary Families Lived. The village is small, perhaps 20, perhaps 30 households arranged around a central open space that serves as both plaza and pasture. The houses are built of fieldstone here rather than the precisely fitted ashlars of Cusco. These are farmers and herders, not stonemasons working under the eye of imperial engineers. The walls are thick anyway, thick enough to hold the warmth of the day and release it slowly through the cold of the night, which is the principle of stone construction at altitude everywhere in the world. Each house is a single room, one door facing east, the direction of the rising sun. No windows, or perhaps one very small opening, just large enough to let a little air in, but not so large that the cold comes with it. The walls are roughly 2 meters high, and they end at the eaves in a dark gap before the grass thatch begins. The tough, dry golden that grows across the high Andean plateau at elevations too cold for most other vegetation makes an extraordinary roofing material. It sheds rain and snow. It insulates. A good roof can last 20 years or more. The smell of it inside the house is dusty and dry with something almost sweet underneath. You step inside. Your eyes adjust. There is no furniture in this room in the way that the word furniture would mean to you. No chairs, no tables, no beds with frames and headboards. The floor is tamped earth, swept clean. Along the walls, at intervals, are small rectangular niches built directly into the stone, some barely large enough for a ceramic cup, some wide enough to hold a folded blanket or a storage vessel. Everything that needs to be kept accessible is in a niche. The niches are precise, their stones fitted as carefully as any other part of the building. Even in the most modest homes, this care was taken. In the center of the room, or sometimes to one side, depending on the size of the house, is the hearth. A stone-lined depression, or a clay stove raised slightly above floor level, with a hole at the top through which the smoke is supposed to rise and escape through the thatch. Supposed to. In practice, the interiors of Inca homes were smoky, especially in wet weather when the thatch held moisture and the fuel burned poorly. The smoke is part of the experience. The smoke is part of the smell. You breathe it in without quite thinking about it, the way people who have always lived with fire breathe it in. The fire burns low now. The family has finished eating. There are 4 of them, a man and a woman, both in their middle years, and 2 children who are not quite sleeping yet. The adults are wrapped in their blankets, thick woven wool blankets of the kind that the Inca made everywhere, in every village, in patterns that encoded information about the maker's community and status. The man's wrap is plain undyed brown and white alpaca wool. The woman's is more colorful, orange and deep red and dark green in geometric shapes that repeat and shift across the fabric. The children are small enough that they are already half asleep, curled against their mother's side. In the corner of the room, something moves, something small and brown, and then another, and then another. Guinea pigs. A small colony of them, perhaps 8 or 10, living in the corner of the family's home as they have been doing for generations. They are food, luxury food in fact, not eaten every day but slaughtered for festivals and for important guests, and they are also companions after a fashion, their constant quiet rustling a familiar sound in the darkness, as ordinary to this family as the sound of the fire. Guinea pigs were also used in divination. A healer, a specialist who understood the language of the body, might pass a live guinea pig over a sick person and then examine its entrails to understand the nature of the illness. This is not strange when you understand that in a world without the germ theory of disease, illness was a spiritual and physical event simultaneously, and diagnosis was accordingly both practical and sacred. But tonight there is no sickness, no divination. Tonight there is only the low fire, and the children asleep, and the sound of the wind against the thatch. The man shifts, tucks the blanket more tightly around himself. The smoke has been making his eyes water. He has spent the day working his field, a terraced plot on the hillside above the village, part of the land that the holds in common. Tomorrow he will do the same. Tonight he is tired in the specific way that people who work with their bodies are tired, the good tiredness that makes lying down feel like a gift. Outside, a dog barks twice and falls silent. The fire settles. The room is warm. Not the warmth of a modern, centrally heated space, not a steady, managed temperature, but warm enough, which at altitude with the right blanket is a different calculation than it is anywhere else. The Inca were experts at warmth. They had to be. Chapter 3: The Hearth Fire, Cooking in the Andes. The evening meal was finished an hour ago, but the clay pot is still on the stove, still faintly warm, and the smell of what was in it remains in the room, a layered, subtle smell that a person from the modern world would probably find immediately recognizable as comfort food. Starch and herb and salt, the smell of something that has been simmering for a long time, the smell of a meal that asked nothing of the person eating it except to be grateful and be warm. The Inca diet at the level of the common farmer was built on a small number of extraordinary crops. Potato first. The Andes is the birthplace of the potato. Hundreds of varieties were cultivated here, far more genetic diversity than exists in any modern commercial crop, adapted to different altitudes and soils and rainfall patterns. Some of these varieties were bitter and could not be eaten fresh, but were perfect for freeze drying into. Others were tender and flowery and made excellent soup. Still others were good boiled whole and eaten with a smear of salt and perhaps a handful of dried herbs. The potato that most of the world eats today, the potato in your kitchen, the potato in every restaurant, the potato in the field across the road from wherever you are lying right now, is a descendant of plants that grew in these mountains, bred and selected over thousands of years of Andean agriculture before the Spanish ships took them back across the ocean. The evening soup that this family ate contained potato, several kinds, added at different times because they cook at different rates. It contained quinoa, the Andean grain that grows at altitudes where wheat cannot survive, with its slight nuttiness and the way it opens like tiny white flowers when it is properly cooked, the grains swelling and becoming translucent at the edges. It contained dried herbs, a pinch of a wild mint that grows at high altitude and has a sharp medicinal quality to it. It was salted with sea salt traded up from the coast, or rock salt from the salt springs that existed in several places across the empire. It was thick. It was nutritious. It was, by most measures, a sensible and sustaining thing to eat after a day of physical work at altitude. Corn, maize, was technically more prestigious than potato in Inca culture. It was the crop of the lowland terraces, the crop that required more sophisticated irrigation and more careful cultivation, and it was most importantly the crop from which was made. But at the highest altitudes, corn did not grow well. Up here, potato and quinoa were the realities of every meal. Corn appeared at festivals in the form of roasted ears or sweet corn soup, or most significantly, as carried up in ceramic vessels from lower communities as an offering or a luxury. Meat was reserved for special occasions. The Inca did not eat meat every day, not even the nobility, not routinely. The llama and alpaca were far more valuable as pack and fiber animals than as food, and slaughtering them was a decision made carefully. Dried camelid meat, Chasqui, was a preserved food available to those who needed to travel or had access to herds, and it occasionally appeared in the evening soup. But the main protein in a common family's diet came from the grain, quinoa, and from the potato, from the occasional egg, and from the when the season or occasion called for it. The stove itself was a practical piece of engineering. Clay formed into a low platform with holes in the top through which ceramic pots could sit, and a space beneath for fuel. The fuel at this altitude was primarily llama and alpaca dung dried, compressed into flat cakes, barely odorless when burning, and extraordinarily efficient as fuel. Wood was scarce on the Altiplano, dung was everywhere. A good dung fire burns slowly and at a steady temperature, which is ideal for the long-simmered soups that were the backbone of Andean cooking. You could leave the pot on the stove while you worked the field and come back to find it still simmering, still doing what it was supposed to do. The woman who cooked this evening, it was usually women's work in common households, though during labor periods when the family was called to work on an imperial project and both adults were away, the state fed them at the work site. She cooked with vessels of her own manufacture or acquired through local exchange. Inca ceramics at the commoner level were functional and beautiful in a quiet way, red-slipped, with dark painted geometric patterns, rounded bottoms designed to sit securely in a stove hole. The shapes were standardized enough across the empire that archaeologists can recognize them immediately in any excavation. A particular pot shape, a particular painted pattern, tells you something about where the vessel was made and when, even without any other context. The smell of the cooking has merged with the smoke. The smoke has merged with the smell of the thatch and the warm animal smell of and the wool smell of the blankets. It is a specific olfactory world, this interior not unpleasant once you are part of it. It is the smell of life being lived inside stone and straw, the smell of warmth maintained against a cold world. The fire needs feeding once more before they sleep. The man rises, himself from the blanket, adds a few cakes of dried dung to the stove. The flame brightens briefly, throwing his shadow onto the stone wall behind him, large and wavering and very human. He settles back down. The children do not wake. The smoke curls toward the thatch and disappears. Chapter 4: The Sacred Drink of the Inca. There is a ceramic vessel sitting in the niche to the left of the door. A squat, rounded bottle, sealed with a clay plug, holding perhaps 2 liters of a liquid that is pale yellow gold in color. The family will drink a cup each before they sleep. This is ordinary. This is simply what people do. The way you might have a final cup of tea or warm milk, or whatever your particular culture uses to mark the transition from the day to the night. But the cup that was drunk earlier in the evening was not ordinary, not entirely. Before the first person drank, the woman poured a small measure from the vessel directly onto the earth floor, a libation, an offering barely conscious as a ritual act because it is so deeply habitual, because it has been done this way for as long as anyone can remember, and the memory of not doing it does not exist. The received her portion first, always first. This was not negotiable. This was not superstition in the dismissive sense. This was the correct protocol for interacting with a world in which the earth was a living entity, a mother, an entity that had given them everything they had, the soil that grew the corn, the rain that watered it, the frost that made and to whom something was always owed. Is made from sprouted corn. The corn, a specific variety, is soaked in water until it germinates, then dried, ground into a coarse flour, mixed with water, boiled for several hours, strained and left to ferment in large ceramic vessels for several days. The resulting drink is mildly alcoholic, perhaps 3 to 4%, comparable to a light beer, and has a slightly sour, slightly sweet taste that is unlike anything in the European tradition of fermented drinks. It is nutritious. It is calorie-dense. It is, in a world where water safety is always uncertain at the household level, considerably safer than untreated water. There was another method of fermentation, used in specific ritual contexts. Some historical accounts describe the process of chewing corn, using the human enzyme amylase present in saliva to begin the conversion of starches to sugars and then to alcohol. This method was documented and was real, but it was not the everyday method used by ordinary households. The germinated corn method was standard. The chewing method was reserved for certain ceremonial applications, and the distinction matters both historically and for understanding the role of in Inca society. Was everywhere in. It was drunk at nearly every social occasion: births, marriages, funerals, festivals, planting ceremonies, harvest celebrations, the completion of a building project, the resolution of a dispute within the. It was served to soldiers before battle. It was poured over the bodies of the dead. It was offered to the sacred sites as the most important liquid gift that humans could give, the best thing that hands and labor could produce from the earth, returned to the earth in gratitude and relationship. The state maintained, as a kind of social lubricant and sacred currency simultaneously, distributing enormous quantities of it to commoners who came to work the labor tax as partial payment for their labor. In the Inca system of reciprocal obligation, the state could not simply take labor from its subjects. It had to give something in return, and what it gave was food, clothing, shelter, and the house of the chosen women in Cuzco and in every major provincial center was, among its other functions, a brewery. The women selected from across the empire, brought to these walled compounds to serve the state, produced enormous quantities of destined for the emperor's table and for the grandest state ceremonies. That was drunk by the Inca himself, and that was offered to the mummified ancestors of the royal line, was made by the women personally chosen for this task, following brewing specifications that went beyond ordinary household practice. But that is for later. Tonight in this village, the is humbler and the ritual is private. The man drinks first from a wooden cup. Then the woman. The flavor sits on the tongue, slightly sour, slightly warming, not strong enough to be intoxicating in 2 cups, but enough to take the edge off the cold, enough to help the muscles unclench after a day's work, enough to make the straw mat feel a little more comfortable than it did before. The children are already asleep and will not drink tonight. The vessel is resealed with its clay plug. The fire is tended one more time. In other households across the village, similar rituals are happening: the last cup, the final libation, the fire tended down to coals. And in the city, in the palaces, in the great walled compounds of the nobility, is flowing in quantities that dwarf anything a village family would see in a year. Gold cups, silver cups, the finest ceramic cups with designs of fire and cloud, filled and refilled by attendants who understood that was not simply a drink, but an enactment of a relationship between the drinker and the earth, between the living and the dead, between the human and the divine. Chapter 5: The Community Life After Dark. A little further along the village, in the largest of the houses, the house of the headman, who acts as the local representative of imperial authority and the keeper of this accounts, a small gathering is happening. This is the bedrock of Inca society. The word is often translated as kinship group or clan, but it means more than that. And was a community of families who shared common ancestry, real or mythological, who collectively held the right to work a particular territory, who owed each other a specific set of mutual obligations, and who were, together, one unit in the vast imperial accounting system that kept running, and might contain a few hundred people or a few thousand. It was not just a social unit. It was an economic unit, a religious unit, and a political unit all at once. The principle that governed relationships was a Quechua word that means reciprocal exchange of labor and goods. If your house needs a new roof, Your members come and help you thatch it. When their fields need extra hands at harvest, you go. No money changes hands. No ledger is kept in any European sense. But the obligation is real, and the social memory that tracks whether obligations are being honored is long and precise. The quipu, the knotted string recording system, was one way of keeping those accounts. The keeper of the quipu sat in the corner of the hedgeman's house, working by firelight, fingers moving through the strings with a practiced ease that no outsider can now fully decode. There was a second principle. Where was bilateral, I help you, you help me, was communal. The whole working together for a collective goal, building a road section, repairing an irrigation channel, terracing a new hillside. Labor produced the great infrastructure of the empire. Labor, organized and directed by the state through the system, built the roads, the warehouses, the temples. But tonight, in the hedgeman's house, the talk is not of labor quotas. The fire is larger here than in the ordinary homes, and the gathering is perhaps 8 adults, sitting on the floor in a rough circle, cups of passing between them. The conversation is low and unhurried. Someone tells a story about the time a neighboring village angered the spirit of the mountain above them, and the spring dried up for a season. Someone else disputes a detail. The hedgeman mediates gently. You can feel the warmth of this room differently than the warmth of the smaller homes. More bodies, more heat, more breath mixing in the firelit air. The ceiling is low enough that the smoke gathers in a visible layer before it finds its way out through the thatch, and in the firelight the smoke layer has a golden edge, drifting, barely moving. Someone shifts to refill a cup from the large vessel near the door. The movement is unhurried, familiar. The cup passes hand to hand with a naturalness that tells you how many times it has traveled this same circle tonight, and the nights before tonight, and the nights before those. In the corner, one of the women has not put down her weaving. She works in the firelight with the ease of long habit, her fingers finding the threads without her eyes needing to check. Andean textile weaving at this period was among the most technically sophisticated in the world, not in the sense of factory sophistication, but in the sense of density, precision, and the encoding of information in pattern. The geometric shapes that appear in Andean cloth are not merely decoration. They indicate the weaver's, her region, her status, her connection to specific sacred sites. A trained eye, reading a person's clothing, could learn a great deal about where they came from and who they were. The wool is alpaca, combed and spun by hand on a drop spindle, dyed with plant and mineral pigments, the deep red of cochineal, the indigo blue, the golden yellow of flowers. The woman's fingers move over, under, through. The pattern grows. This is work done in the evening because evening is what is available after the day's agricultural labor, and the textile output of a family was part of what it owed to the state. But the weaving is not joyless. She is doing something she has done since she was old enough to hold a spindle. Her hands know this work the way your hands know something you have done 10,000 times. They know it in the dark. The in the corner ties a final knot on his string and examines it by firelight, tilting his head slightly. The quipu hanging from his hands is perhaps 40 centimeters long, a main cord with pendant strings branching from it, each string a different color, each knot in a specific position indicating a specific number in the base-10 system. What the strings record tonight might be a count of the llamas in the community's herd. It might be a record of the Labor Day's ode, and worked this season. It might be something more complex. Scholars are still working on the full range of Qipu encoding. He holds the completed section up to the firelight, turning it slowly, checking his knots the way a reader checks a sentence before setting it down. Satisfied, he lowers it. His hands rest still in his lap for a moment, the stillness of a craftsman who has finished a careful piece of work. Outside, the wind picks up for a moment, pressing against the thatch. Then it softens. The story in the circle has arrived at its ending, wherever that is, and several people laugh quietly, a warm sound, a contained sound, the sound of laughter in a room with sleeping children somewhere nearby, a sound that has been modulated by consideration for the sleepers. The headman says something in a low voice. Someone responds. The fire settles slightly, the flames pulling inward as the fuel reduces, and the room dims a shade, and one of the older men leans forward to add another piece of dung cake to the stove without anyone asking him to. He has been watching the fire. Someone always watches the fire. Chapter 6. The Runners, Messages in the Night. 15 kilometers from the village, up the mountain on the main road, there is a tambo. Tambo, a rest station, a way station, a node in the network. They were spaced every 10 to 15 kilometers along the Nan, the great road network of the empire, which means they were spaced at a distance a fit young man could run at speed. Because that was the purpose of the tambo, to house the were young men, boys, sometimes barely past adolescence, recruited from local communities to serve as relay runners. They were selected for speed and stamina, trained in the art of running at altitude, and stationed at tambos on rotation, usually in pairs or small groups, so that at any hour of the day or night, there was always someone ready to run. The message system operated, as far as the evidence suggests, continuously day and night. The tambo on this stretch of road is a small structure, or perhaps 2 or 3 structures, built of the same rough fieldstone as the village homes. Inside, a storage space for dried food, the state kept tambos stocked with freeze-dried potato and dried camelid meat, enough to sustain the runners on duty, sleeping space, and a small hearth. The fire is burning. 2 are here tonight. One is sleeping deeply on his mat. The other is sitting by the door, wrapped in his blanket, watching the road in both directions. He is perhaps 17 years old. His lungs, adapted to altitude from birth, are extraordinary instruments, deep and efficient, capable of sustaining a running pace at 4,000 meters that would leave a sea-level visitor gasping after 50 meters. He wears sandals of llama leather with soles cut thick at the heel, and a cap of woven alpaca against the cold. Around his waist, a small bag. In the bag, if he is currently carrying a message, might be a qipu, a knotted string recording the gist of whatever communication is being relayed. Or it might be a verbal message, memorized word for word, to be recited to the next runner who will repeat it to the next, all the way to Cuzco or all the way to the furthest provincial capital. The system was fast. A message from Cusco could reach the city of Quito 2,000 kilometers north in approximately 1 week via continuous relay. Individual runners could cover 40 to 50 kilometers in their leg of the relay. In optimal conditions and on the paved stone roads, relay teams operating continuously could achieve speeds that would be remarkable by any standard. The Spanish who arrived in the 16th century were astonished by it. They had nothing comparable. An empire the size of continental Europe, communicating with the speed of a running athlete day and night. There is something worth pausing to notice about this. The system was not just a communications network in the logistical sense. It was also the nervous system of an empire that could not write in the European sense of the word. Without writing, the relay of spoken messages and encoded quipu strings became the means through which an emperor in Cusco knew within a week what was happening at the frontier of his empire. A rebellion suppressed, a bridge washed out by flooding, a provincial administrator requesting grain from the stores, all of this information traveled on the feet of young men through the mountain night. There were, accordingly, respected figures. They were not slaves or servants. They served their rotation as part of the labor tax, but the role carried status. To be selected for the was an acknowledgement of fitness and reliability. The communities that sent to the tambos were expected to supply not just the runners, but also food and fuel for the tambo itself, their ongoing contribution to the imperial network. Sitting in the doorway of the tambo, the young runner can hear the road, the sound of the wind through the mountain pass above. Somewhere, a stone shifting in the cold, the mountain settling. The deep silence that exists at altitude when there is no wind and nothing moving. A silence so complete it seems to have physical weight. Then a sound, very faint at first, from up the road. A horn. The conch shell trumpet that used to announce their approach, so that the receiving runner could be ready, standing in the road when the relay reached him. One runner never stopped. He slowed enough to hand off the quipu or speak the message, and the receiving runner was already running alongside him, matching pace, taking the handoff, and accelerating away before the arriving runner fully stopped. The young man in the tambo doorway is on his feet in an instant. He shrugs off the blanket, reaches up to take his cap more firmly on his head. His sleeping companion does not wake. He is not the one on duty. The sound of feet on stone coming down the road from the north. The sounds again closer. He steps onto the road. His breath is a small cloud in the cold air. He is ready. Chapter 7. The Nan Roads Through the Darkness. The road that runs on is one of tens of thousands of kilometers of engineered pathway that the Inca built across the most dramatic terrain on Earth. The Nan, the Royal Road, or Noble Road in Quechua, was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2014, which required 6 countries to cooperate in mapping and documenting it. Even now, after 5 centuries of neglect and overgrowth and colonial development on top of it, the road system is extraordinary. Archaeologists following it through the Andes find sections of original stone paving still in place, still solid. The fitted stones barely shifted after 500 years. The road beneath the feet tonight is stone-paved, narrow, perhaps 1 to 3 meters wide on most stretches, wider at important junctions. The stones are not the elaborate architectural quality stonework of Cusco. They are functional, laid on a prepared base, fitted well enough to provide a surface that sheds water and doesn't shift underfoot. At the edges, there are sometimes small channels cut to drain rainwater off the road surface. In places where the road crosses wet ground, it is raised on a causeway. In places where it climbs a cliff face, it is cut into the stone in steps. The genius of the road is not always visible in any single section, but in its totality, the way it navigated every obstacle the Andes could present and continued anyway, over passes above 5,000 meters, down through cloud forest, across coastal desert. The rope bridges, they were perhaps the most remarkable engineering achievement of the road system. Built entirely of braided grasses, specifically grass and the fiber of certain highland plants, they spanned gorges that no other technology of the period could have crossed. The longest ones exceeded 100 meters. They swayed. They were, by the reports of those who walked them, alarming, but they worked. They were maintained by local communities on a rotational basis, replacing the grasses as they weakened, rebraiding the cables, and the most important bridges were so well maintained that they lasted well into the colonial period. One bridge was still being maintained using traditional methods until very recently, continuing a practice that stretches back to before the Spanish arrived. The bridge cables were woven from bundles of braided grass twisted around a core of other grasses, the whole assembly lashed together with a precision that sounds improvised, but was in fact the product of centuries of accumulated technique. The major cables were as thick as a human torso. When the bridge was new, it barely swayed. As the grasses aged, it developed more movement, which is why the maintenance cycles were so important, why every community living near a major bridge had an obligation to contribute labor to its upkeep. Tonight the road through the pass is empty except for the running. The moon is up, not full, perhaps half, casting enough light on the pale stone road surface to run without a torch. The mountains on either side are enormous dark shapes, their snow-capped peaks faintly luminous in the moonlight. The wind comes through the pass in gusts that smell of ice, and faintly, of the high-altitude grasses that grow in the sheltered valleys below. Not always empty, this road. Llama caravans moved through the night sometimes, the camelid pack animals of the Andes, each one carrying perhaps 25 to 30 kilograms of goods, managed by who knew the road so well they could walk it in near darkness. A caravan moved slowly, the bells on the led llamas making a soft, rhythmic clinking. Sometimes a caravan of soldiers passed in the early morning hours, a unit of the standing army in transit to some posting in the provinces, their sandals making the same rhythmic sound on the stone. Occasionally a noble in his litter, borne on the shoulders of designated carriers, a form of transport reserved for those of sufficient rank, traveled by night to reach a destination before the heat of the day. But tonight just the runner. You stand to one side and watch him pass. He is not looking at the scenery. His eyes are on the road surface 3 meters ahead of his feet. His breathing is deep and regular. He is in that runner's state that experienced endurance athletes describe, a kind of moving meditation, where the body handles the mechanics of running and the mind empties, or drifts to a specific quiet place, or attends only to the message stored in the quipu or the words memorized for repetition, the sound of his sandals on the stone. The steady metronomic rhythm of it, fading down the road into the dark. The road stretches away in both directions, disappearing into the night. Somewhere in the distance, another tambo, another fire, another runner waiting, leaning in a doorway, listening for the, and beyond that, another tambo and another runner. The network is alive in the dark, each node a small fire, each fire a waiting person, each person connected to every other person along the same thread of stone road stretching from one end of the world to the other. The wind comes through the pass again. The stone is cold. The moon is high. The road continues. Chapter 8: The Gold and the Gods. There is a moment when you stand in what remains of the today, the curved stone wall at the base of the convent of Santo in Cuzco, the only intact portion of the great temple complex that survived the Spanish demolition, when you understand that something vast was removed from this place. The stones that remain are almost unsettlingly perfect, fitted together without mortar, the joins so tight you cannot push a knife blade between them, the wall curving with a precision that defies easy explanation. These are the stones that the Spanish decided to leave, too well fitted, too solid, too much a foundation for whatever they planned to build on top. And what they built on top has cracked and collapsed and been repaired repeatedly in the earthquakes that regularly shake Cusco. The Inca wall has not moved. The name means golden enclosure in Quechua, and it was. The Spanish chroniclers who entered the shortly after the conquest of 1532 were professional conquerors who had seen remarkable things before: the treasures of Aztec Mexico, the wealth of other conquered peoples. And yet their descriptions of thee are shot through with a disbelief that even ambition and calculation couldn't quite suppress. The walls were lined with gold. Not gilded, not painted to look like gold, lined with sheet gold, perhaps 700 sheets of it, according to the chronicles of Andy Vega, each sheet roughly 30 centimeters wide and as thick as a belt. The outer walls were also banded with gold. There was a golden disc representing Inti, the sun, above the altar. There were golden representations of the moon, the stars, and the thunder. In the garden of the temple precinct, everything was made of gold and silver in miniature, golden corn stalks with silver leaves, golden llamas, golden shepherds. Even the soil of the sacred garden was, in some accounts, replaced with gold dust. These are Spanish accounts, and we must be honest about that. The chroniclers had reasons, political and personal, to emphasize the empire's wealth. We cannot verify the exact number of gold sheets because they no longer exist. All of it was melted down, all of it. The gold was shipped to Spain to finance the ambitions of the Spanish crown, and the temple was demolished and its foundations used for the church and convent built on top of it. What the Inca spent generations creating, the Spanish destroyed in years. What archaeology has confirmed is the extraordinary quality of the stonework and the orientation of the windows and the overall plan of the complex, and these are consistent with a building of extraordinary significance and craftsmanship. But tonight, in thee as it existed before all of that, you are standing in the outer courtyard. The temple compound was a collection of buildings arranged around a central courtyard. The main temple of the sun, smaller temples dedicated to the moon, the stars, the thunder god, and the creator. The whole complex was surrounded by a curved perimeter wall. That curve is what survives today, the stones too perfectly fitted to be easily demolished. The smell here is incense. Copal, a tree resin burned across much of the ancient Americas as an offering to the divine. It burns slowly and produces a white, slightly sweet smoke that rises in columns in still air. Tonight the air in the courtyard is almost still. and the columns of incense smoke rising from the braziers in front of the temples are nearly vertical, bending only slightly as they thin and dissipate above the roofline. The smell of copal is the smell of prayer here. It is the smell of approach, of the careful crossing of a threshold between the ordinary and the sacred. The sacred fire burns inside the main temple. It has burned continuously since the temple was built. Maintaining it was the responsibility of the chosen women who worked in rotation, keeping the flame alive through every night, every storm, every cold season. This fire was not merely symbolic. In Inca theology, it was Inti himself, present in physical form, the sun's earthly representative, burning. To let it go out would be catastrophic, a failure of the most fundamental obligation between the empire and its divine patron. A priest moves through the courtyard, making his evening circuit. He wears a long tunic of fine cloth, dark against the dark of the courtyard, and he carries a small ceramic vessel from which he pours a measure of onto the ground at the base of each significant stone and at the doorway of each temple, offering acknowledgement, maintenance of the relationship between the living and the divine. This is not performed for an audience. It is performed because it is time to perform it, because the evening requires it, because the world will not hold together if it is not done. The temple windows, designed with careful orientation, admit no moonlight at this hour. But on solstice mornings, at specific calendar moments, the sun's first light enters through those windows and falls on the altar. The priests who studied the sky, who tracked the sun's movement through the year with tools and stones and the alignment of the temple itself, knew to within a few days when the solstice would come, when the planting season should begin, when the festivals should be held. Tonight there is no festival. Tonight there is only the incense and the fire and the priest making his slow circuit, and the city beyond the walls beginning to breathe the deep breath of sleep. Chapter 9: Dark Rivers in the Sky, Inca Astronomy. Above the temple, above the city, above the mountains, the Milky Way, you have to see it from here to understand what the Inca saw. Not the Milky Way of a city sky, where light pollution reduces it to a faint smear that most people can't quite make out. The Milky Way from 4,000 meters altitude on a clear night with no artificial light for hundreds of kilometers. It is a different thing entirely. It is a physical presence, a river of light so bright you can see your shadow by it, so dense with stars in the central band that the individual stars become indistinguishable, and what you see is simply a river. Bright, flowing, real. The Inca called it the sacred river. And they believed, genuinely and believed, that it was the mirror image in the sky of the river on earth, the great river that flows through the sacred valley below Cuzco, the river that gives the valley its extraordinary fertility, the river that everything in the valley depends on. Sky and earth as mirrors of each other, the river above reflecting the river below. But the Inca relationship with the night sky was not quite what you might expect. They were certainly careful and sophisticated astronomical observers. They tracked the movements of the sun, the moon, the planets, the Pleiades, which they called the storehouse, with extraordinary precision. The Pleiades rising at a particular angle in a particular month told them when to plant certain crops. The disappearance of the Pleiades below the horizon for a period was ominous. But the element of Inca astronomy that most surprises modern people is this: the Inca also read the darkness. The dark patches in the Milky Way, the places where dense clouds of interstellar dust block the light of the stars behind them, creating gaps, holes, rivers of absence in the river of light. These were constellations. Not constellations made of bright stars, constellations made of darkness. The scholar Gary, who worked with communities in the Peruvian highlands in the 1970s and 1980s, documented the traditional system of dark cloud constellations, Yana in Quechua, meaning black clouds, that still persisted in living knowledge. The most important of these was the llama. She was visible from roughly November to April, drinking from the river, from her dark body stretching across the sky, her two eyes the bright stars Alpha and Beta, and two of the closest stars to our own sun. Look at her long enough and you can see her. A dark shape cradled in the brightness, large and unmistakable once you know where to look, the way all perceptual shifts work. Once you have seen the hidden figure, you cannot unsee it. Other dark constellations accompanied the llama across the sky. The fox slinking behind her, the toad called the serpent, the tinamou bird sitting on her nest below the Southern Cross, the partridge-like bird called. These figures were not abstract symbols. They were, in Inca cosmological thinking, real animals in the sky, the celestial versions of the animals on Earth, and their movements across the night had real consequences for the equivalent animals below. If the sky llama was in a certain position, it told you something about the llamas on your mountainside. The priests who watched the sky from and from observatory points across the empire were tracking all of this. They were reading a sky that was simultaneously a text and a living landscape, not separate from the earth, but its echo, its parallel, its deepest explanation. Tonight, the priest in the courtyard pauses his circuit and looks up. The llama is visible now, rising in the southeast. Her dark bulk unmistakable in the river of light. Her eyes, Alpha and Beta, very bright, very steady. The fox is behind her. The toad is near the southern horizon. Everything is in its place. He stands for a long moment, reading what is there. There is a particular quality to this act, the standing still, the looking up, the holding of knowledge against the visible sky, that belongs to a world in which the sky is not decoration, but instruction. The priest is not admiring the view. He is doing his work, and the work at this hour is to confirm that the world is in order, that the sacred animals are where they should be, that the great river is running as it has always run, that nothing has shifted out of its proper place. The sky is a record, and he is its reader, and what he reads tonight tells him what it tells him every clear night. The system holds. The order is maintained. Inti will return. He watches a moment longer. The llama drinks without raising her head. The fox follows, patient in the dark. The toad, low on the southern horizon, will set soon. When the toad sets, it means something specific about the season that the priests had learned to read as surely as a farmer reads weather. Each position, each rising and setting, each angle of the Pleiades above the mountain ridge, these were a language, and this man could read it. He had spent years learning it, sitting out on nights just like this one in the compound of his teacher beside him, pointing out each dark form against the brightness until it became visible and then unmissable and then as familiar as a face. You stand beside him and look where he is looking. Try it if you haven't already, not at the brightest things in the sky, but at the spaces between them. not at what is lit, but at what is dark. Let your eyes go soft. Let them stop searching for points of light and start taking in the shapes that the darkness makes. The Milky Way above you is a river. Along the river, in the river, there are shapes made of its absence. There is something large and patient there, dark and still, with two bright eyes watching the water. Then he continues his circuit. Chapter 10: The Chosen Women and Sacred Fire. In the House of the Chosen Women, on the northwest side of Cusco's main plaza, the night is not entirely quiet. It never quite is. The compound is walled. The walls are high enough and smooth enough that the building presents a blank face to the street. No windows visible from outside. A single guarded door that leads into an interior world that the ordinary citizen of Cusco never saw. Inside, a series of courtyards, storerooms, weaving rooms, a kitchen, sleeping rooms, and at the heart of it, the sacred fire. The chosen women who lived here were not prisoners, but they were not free in the way that ordinary citizens were free. They had been selected from communities across the empire at the age of 8 to 10, chosen by imperial inspectors who traveled to every village on a regular circuit, looking for girls of unusual beauty, intelligence, or talent. Being chosen was in many senses an honor. It elevated the family, connected it to the imperial center, and freed the girl from the agricultural labor that consumed most lives. But it also meant leaving home at an age when home was everything. Inside the chosen women were educated in ways that were largely closed to women outside the compound. They learned to weave cloth, the highest quality textile in the Inca world, made from the finest alpaca wool, and sometimes from fiber, which was rarer and lighter than anything else available, almost impossibly soft, warmer weight for weight than anything else that could be produced without industrial machinery. Cloth sometimes incorporated feathers, the brilliant feathers of tropical birds brought from the lowlands, worked into the textile in patterns of such precision that they appear almost painted. A piece of cloth held up to the light had a luminous, almost transparent quality that coarser wool never achieved. It was reserved for the Inca, for ritual offerings burned in the sacred fire, for the most important diplomatic gifts. The women who wove it were trained for years before they were considered capable of producing work of the required standard. They also learned to brew the ceremonial. Not the ordinary village, the state-grade fermented corn drink that would be distributed at the great festivals, that would be offered to the mummies of the ancestors, that would be poured in libation at every significant moment of the imperial calendar. The specifications were different. The process was longer. The quality was controlled, and they maintained the fires. In the main chamber of there was a fire that was never allowed to go out. The who tended it worked in rotation through the night, not because the fire required constant attention every minute, but because the sacred fire required a human witness. Someone always present, someone always watching and ready. If the fire showed signs of weakening, the attendant added fuel. If it showed signs of extinguishing, she called for help. This fire was not watched because it might spread. It was watched because its continuation was an act of faith. Tonight, one of the perhaps 19 or 20 years old, from a village to the south, one who has been in the for 9 or 10 years now, is sitting beside the sacred fire. She has a piece of weaving in her lap, because the night hours can be long and the hands like to be occupied. But she is not entirely focused on the weaving. Her eyes keep returning to the fire, checking it, the way a mother checks a sleeping infant, reflexively, continuously, without quite making a deliberate decision to look. Fire is fine. It has been fine for years and years. It will be fine tonight, but she watches anyway. The sound of the compound at this hour is the sound of sleeping, the long, slow breathing of dozens of women in the sleeping rooms beyond the courtyard. A dog outside the walls, far away, barking at something and then stopping. The faint sound of wind over the roof tiles. She adds a small piece of fuel. The flame brightens for a moment, casting new shadows on the stone walls. Then it settles, steady and warm. Watch it settle. The flame pulls inward slightly after the brightness of the new fuel, finding its new shape, and then it steadies, the same flame it was a moment ago, only fractionally higher. The color at its base, a deep blue that fades through orange to the pale gold at the tip. Stone walls hold their shadows. The smell in this chamber is the smell of specific, deliberate burning, not the dung fuel of the common household, but something cleaner, drier, the fine wood that was brought up specifically for this fire, selected for how it burns rather than simply how long it lasts. This is a fire that has its own quality. It has been fed carefully for years. She has been in this room long enough tonight that she has stopped noticing the particular quality of the silence here. Early in any watch, the silence of thee is something you hear actively, the muffled breathing beyond the courtyard wall, the creak of some stone somewhere settling in the cold, the faint sound of wind above the roof. But after hours of it, the silence becomes the medium you live in rather than the thing you listen to. You stop hearing it and start simply existing within it, the way you stop tasting water once you have been drinking it long enough. She picks up her weaving. Over, under, through. The geometric section she is working on now is a border pattern, the angular repeat that marks this piece as belonging to a specific ceremonial tradition, a pattern she was taught in this very room, the motif passed from teacher to learner across more generations than anyone has counted. Her fingers know exactly where the next thread goes before her eyes confirm it. This is knowledge held in the hands as much as in the mind. In the dark, under a loose blanket on a cold night, she could continue this pattern by touch alone. She has done it, in fact, on nights when the lamp burned low and she chose not to disturb the silence by calling for more oil. The fire is steady. It will be fine until the next watch comes. Her fingers move. The thread pulls. The pattern grows by one more row. Chapter 11. The Royal Court. Mummies at the Feast. There is something you need to understand about Inca kingship, and it is something that even experienced historians sometimes struggle to convey without it sounding wrong, like folklore, like something that needs to be debunked rather than understood. The dead were not gone. This is not a metaphor for memory or grief. The Inca dead, specifically the royal dead, the deceased Incas and their queens, were physically present in the ongoing life of the court. Their mummified bodies, cold, were maintained in palatial rooms with all the trappings of the living. They had attendants, personal servants assigned to them in death as in life. These attendants fanned them in hot weather, shooed flies, brought them food and spoke to them, and interpreted their responses through a kind of spiritual mediation that the members practiced as a serious and respected skill. The mummies were brought out on ceremonial occasions, not hidden, not kept in dark tombs, and placed in the main plaza in a great assembly of the dead, all the former emperors together, in order, attended by their respective families. They were offered food, and which was burned as an offering since they could not consume it directly. They were consulted on state matters, invoked in diplomatic negotiations, and treated as participants in the ongoing life of the empire. The word refers to the royal kinship corporation that formed around each deceased Inca. When a ruler died, his immediate relatives, his children, his wives, his siblings, did not inherit his wealth. Instead, they formed a corporation that held and managed all the property of the deceased in the deceased's name in perpetuity. The new Inca, usually a son, often selected from among the children of designated secondary wives, had to build his own wealth, his own palaces, his own estates, entirely from new sources. The dead king owned everything he had ever owned forever, managed by his descendants on his behalf. This had enormous political consequences. A new ruler who needed to build his own power base had very strong incentives to conquer new territory, because conquest was how new wealth was generated, and all the old wealth was still tied up in the estates and enterprises of his predecessors. The mummy system, in a very direct mechanical way, drove Inca imperial expansion. Each new emperor needed new lands, new agricultural terraces, new mines, new palaces, because the old ones were all still owned by old emperors. The dead, by remaining propertied, kept the living empire moving outward. But beyond the political mechanics, the mummy system reflected a deep cosmological truth. In Inca thinking, death was not a wall. The dead were still present in this world, in a real and accessible sense. You could speak to them. They could respond through their attendants who understood their gestures and inclinations. They ate and drank symbolically. They attended meetings. Spanish chronicles record one mummy being sent as an ambassador to negotiate with a living ruler on specific political questions. The mummy did not travel alone, of course. His members spoke on his behalf, expressing his known positions and preferences. But the fiction, or the theology, was that the ancestor himself was present and participating. Tonight in the palace compound, in a room hung with fine textiles and lit by a few small oil lamps placed in the wall niches, the mummified ancestor sits in his assigned place. He is wrapped, bundled, really, in layers of the finest cloth, shaped and bound into a seated figure, his face partially visible beneath the wrappings, desiccated and still, but unmistakably present. The cloth wrappings are of extraordinary quality, the geometric patterns precise and colorful even in the lamplight, and around his bundled form are placed small offerings, ceramic vessels, dried flowers, a few pieces of food that will be burned in the morning. Around him, his attendants are performing the final ritual of the day, the closing address, the summary of what has happened in the court today that he should know about, the formal requests for his guidance and blessing. An attendant speaks to thee in a low voice formally, addressing him by his full royal title. Another pours a small measure of into the brazier, the liquid hissing on the hot coals. The smell of burned is something between caramelized corn and smoke. It is not entirely clear, from where we stand 5.5 centuries later, how much of this was sincere theological conviction and how much was political performance, the maintenance of legitimacy, the management of inherited authority. But the evidence suggests strongly that it was both simultaneously, in the way that many human ritual practices are both things at once, genuinely felt and politically useful, sacred and functional, intimate and institutional. The ancestor sits in the lamplight. The smoke of the incense rises above him. The city outside begins to quiet. Chapter 12 and the Frozen Pantry. High on the hillside above the village, above the terraced fields, in the darkness and the cold, the potatoes are already freezing. They were spread out yesterday on the flat ground at the top of the slope, away from the buildings where nothing can shade them during the day or shelter them from the frost at night. Dozens of them, small, frost-resistant native varieties, the bitter kind that cannot be eaten straight, the kind that has been bred over centuries specifically to withstand the process they are about to undergo. The bitterness in these potatoes comes from the same compounds that cause the pale patches on a potato left too long in sunlight to be slightly toxic. In these highland varieties, the concentration is much higher and they cannot be eaten directly, but freeze them and press them and dry them, and something happens to those compounds as the cellular structure breaks down. The bitterness is not removed entirely, but it is rendered acceptable, and what remains is nourishing and stores almost indefinitely. The temperature tonight has dropped below -5 degrees Celsius. At this altitude, on a clear night with no cloud cover, it can drop further than that. The potatoes, exposed to the open sky, are freezing from the outside in. The ice crystals forming inside the potato cells are breaking down the cellular structure, which is exactly what is supposed to happen. This is not an accident of climate. This is a technology, and a sophisticated one, developed at some point deep in Andean prehistory, when people living at altitude worked out that the freeze-thaw cycle of the altiplano nights could be used. That what happens to a potato left outside in this cold is not simply damage, but transformation. Tomorrow morning, when the sun is up and the temperature has risen, women of the will come up to the field and begin treading the potatoes, walking over them, pressing the ice and the broken cellular water out through the skin, squeezing the frozen potato flat. The treading is heavy work, done collectively, and the result of the first treading is something soft and wet, like a pressed sponge. The potatoes are spread out again, and the sun dries what the treading expelled, and then the night freezes again, and the next morning they tread again. After 5 to 7 cycles of freezing and pressing and drying, what remains is white, dry, light as chalk, hard as stone, weighing perhaps 1/10 of the original potato, and storable for up to 10 years without spoiling. 10 years. In a world before refrigeration, before canning, before any of the industrial food preservation techniques that modern people take entirely for granted, 10 years of shelf life is an almost incomprehensible achievement. Was the empire's insurance policy. It was the reason the Inca could keep armies in the field across vast distances, could maintain a permanent corps of workers on major construction projects, could survive the bad years when the rains failed and the harvest was poor. The state warehouses that dotted the hillsides above every major settlement were filled primarily with, supplemented by dried camelid meat called Chasqui, the origin of the English word jerky, via the Quechua Chasqui, dried fish carried up from the coast, and freeze-dried quinoa. The warehouses were positioned on hillsides specifically to exploit the natural refrigeration of altitude and the constant wind, and they were constructed to maximize airflow with no internal walls blocking circulation. They were, for their time and place, extraordinarily effective storage technology. The buildings themselves were designed with a kind of austere engineering logic, round or rectangular stone structures elevated from the ground, with small ventilation holes, their contents arranged to allow air to move through. When Spanish observers arrived in the 16th century, they wrote with some astonishment about the quantities of stored goods, enough food in some provincial to feed entire armies for months. The storage system was not merely economic, it was a form of political legitimacy. The Inca demonstrated his authority partly by feeding his subjects, by being the entity that could mobilize the food of the when local harvests failed, by being the source of sustenance when individual communities could not sustain themselves. The system, through which subjects contributed labor to the state, was partly justified by this reciprocity. The state stored food and distributed it. Subjects worked and were fed in return. The relationship was not free, but it was not simply exploitative either. It was a specific exchange, formally articulated and generally maintained. Tonight the potatoes on the hillside are quiet in their freezing. The stars are out in numbers too large to contemplate. The temperature is still dropping. The molecular changes happening inside each frozen tuber are slow and patient and will take several more nights to complete. In the above the village, the existing stores of last year's and the year before's sit in the darkness. Dry, hard, odorless, almost indestructible. The empire's patience made solid. Chapter 13. Music and Ceremony, Sounds of the Night. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the village, along the path that leads up toward the sacred boulder on the ridge above the fields where offerings are left at planting and harvest, you can hear music. Hear it before you see anything. The called in Spanish is a set of hollow reed tubes of different lengths, bound together side by side, producing different notes when you blow across the top of each tube. The Inca version is played by two people, not one. The two halves of the instrument, called arca, and are held by different players who alternate notes, creating the melody between them in a kind of musical conversation. This technique of hocketing, interlocking, requires the players to know each other's rhythm deeply, to anticipate, to breathe in the gaps the other creates. It makes the music a fundamentally communal act. You cannot play in the traditional Andean style alone. The music requires two bodies, two sets of lungs, two minds in the same rhythm. It is an instrument that insists on company. The sound of the at distance, in the thin air at altitude at night, is extraordinary. The tones are not quite like anything else. Slightly breathy, slightly hollow, carrying further than you would expect, with a quality that seems to suit these mountains, these valleys, this particular relationship between rock and air and emptiness. It travels across the dark terraced hillside and arrives at you softened, changed by the distance, but still recognizable as something human and intentional in the middle of the mountain quiet. There is also a notched flute, made from reed or bone or clay, held vertically and blown across a V-shaped notch at the top. 6 finger holes give it its range. The player is sitting on the rock beside the legs folded beneath him, playing in the pentatonic scale 5 notes, rather than the 7 of European scales, which gives the music its characteristic quality of suspension, of never quite resolving in the way that music built on a 7-note scale eventually resolves, always arriving somewhere, always coming to a conclusion. The pentatonic scale circles. It returns without fully landing. It has a quality of open questions asked quietly in the dark. The melody turns back on itself, rises, falls, circles. It does not tell a story in a linear sense. It is more like weather. It changes without urgency. It returns to places it has been before. It has its own internal logic that is not narrative. Music was not primarily entertainment. This is not to say it was joyless. The Inca loved music, used it everywhere, incorporated it into every significant aspect of life. But it was not conceived as performance in the way a modern concert is performance. It was communication with ancestors, with the apis, with the earth, with the sky. It was medicine. Healers used specific songs and rhythms in healing rituals, believing that certain sounds could affect the body's balance in the way certain plants affected it. It was agriculture. Planting songs accompanied the planting of seeds, and harvest songs accompanied the gathering, and the songs were not decoration layered on top of the work, but part of the work itself. The way the work needed to be done correctly. Drums were also part of the musical tradition, hand drums and frame drums, beaten in patterns that communicated as much through rhythm as through melody. Rattles, made of shell or gourd, marked the downbeat. Ceramic ocarinas, small, round, finger-hole instruments that sound like little birds, were found everywhere in Andean archaeology, from the humblest village middens to the most elaborate ceremonial deposits. Music was not something reserved for specialists. Everyone participated. The specialist musicians, the trained singers and players who served at temples and in the court, were a separate category, but around every community fire, at every gathering, music happened. The player has been here for perhaps an hour. He came up from the village with a small offering, a dried piece of camelid meat, a few kernels of dried corn, which he left at the base of the stone. The stone is not carved. It does not need to be. It is sacred because it has always been sacred, because there has always known it to be sacred, because the spring that emerges from the rock just below it has sustained this hillside for longer than memory reaches. The sacred is not always in the elaborately constructed. Sometimes it is in the particular stone that stands in the particular place where the water comes up from the earth. He plays. The music moves through the dark air. The stars above him are the same stars they have always been, but the way he understands them, the river of light above, the dark animals moving through it, is a way of understanding the world that is entirely his own, entirely of this place, entirely of these people. A conch shell sounds from somewhere down the valley, a distant ceremony at a larger, the sound resonant and deep, carrying for kilometers in the still night air. The acknowledgement that the night's rituals are being performed, that the connections are being maintained, that the web of sacred obligation that holds the world together is being honored. The musician pauses his playing to listen to this resonant call fade into the distance. Then he begins again. The notes climb the hillside in the dark, reaching nothing and everything. Chapter 14: The Three Worlds, What Darkness Meant. The Inca understood the universe as divided into three-layered realms, each distinct and each interpenetrating the others in ways that required careful attention. The upper world, the sky, the realm of the gods, the home of Inti, the sun god, of the moon, of the stars, of the thunder. The supreme creator lived here, having set the cosmos in order and then withdrawn to the periphery, leaving Inti as the presiding divine presence of the working universe. It was not separate from the world in the way that many religions conceive of a divine realm. It was close, present, readable. When you watched the sky, you were observing directly. The sky was not a symbol of the divine. It was the divine visible. This world, the realm of the living, of daily human experience, of ordinary time, but also of the sacred sites, the which were points where the divine pressed through into the ordinary. Not everything in K was ordinary. Mountains, springs, distinctive rocks, places where lightning struck, places where rivers joined, all of these were potential, places where and K touched. The 328 along the lines radiating from the were not arbitrary. They were the map of those touch points, the documented places where the two worlds were closest. The inner world, the underworld, the realm of cold and darkness below the surface of the earth. In Inca cosmology, seeds germinated in before pushing up into K. Rivers had their sources in, rising up through the earth to become springs and streams. Birth itself was understood as emergence from the dead who had lived badly dwelled here, in a place of cold and darkness, eating only rocks. The lord of this realm was not quite the same as the devil of Christian theology, though the Spanish missionaries found it politically convenient to map one onto the other, became associated with the Christian devil in colonial period texts, and it is important to be careful about this conflation when reading historical sources. In pre-conquest Inca religion was a more ambiguous figure, dangerous, powerful, dwelling in darkness, but not necessarily evil in a moral sense, so much as associated with forces that required respect and caution rather than simple condemnation. The creation story behind this cosmology was the story of the supreme creator deity, described as a tall, white-bearded, white-robed figure, though these descriptions may reflect colonial-era reinterpretations, rose from lake during a time of primordial darkness. He created the sun, the moon, and the stars. He created the first humans by breathing life into stone, but these first humans were giants, and they displeased him, and he destroyed them with a great flood, lasting 60 days and 60 nights. Then he created again, smaller this time, human-sized. He sent the ancestors of the Inca and Mama to the surface of the earth, guided by a golden staff that would sink into the earth at the place where civilization should be founded. It sank at Cuzco. Everything that followed, every road, every terrace, every quipunat was built in the place the golden staff chose. The concept of a cosmic overturning described moments when the three worlds could shift dramatically in their relationship to each other, when the established order could be overthrown by forces from, or, the word is related to, the name adopted by the great Inca who likely built, a name that asserted his own transformative power. his capacity to overturn the cosmic order and remake it. At night, in Inca thinking, the boundary between these worlds became thinner. This is a nearly universal human intuition, darkness as a liminal space, night as a time when the usual rules of the waking world are less reliable. But in Inca cosmology, it was not merely a feeling. It was a documented fact about how the world worked. The ancestors, who existed in a realm that was neither K nor entirely, who were present in their mummified bodies in this world, while also belonging to a world the living could not fully access, were more accessible after dark. The Apis, the mountain spirits, spoke more clearly after dark. They were more potent. Night was not the opposite of sacred. Night was when the sacred was most present. This is why many ceremonies happened at night, not because of theatrical effect or dramatic staging. Because night was when the world was most open, when the walls between the three worlds were at their thinnest, and the communication between them was most possible. In a village somewhere on the Altiplano, a healer, perhaps one of the itinerant herbalist healers whose knowledge spanned hundreds of medicinal plants, is sitting with a sick child. The child has had a fever for 2 days. That has already applied his plant medicines, a poultice of specific leaves, a tea brewed from bark, a bitter tincture given in drops on the tongue. But he is also doing something else. He is singing. Quietly, continuously, in a low monotone that does not seem to be intended for the child or for the adults watching anxiously, but for something else in the room, for whatever has caused the illness, or for whatever can cure it, or for both simultaneously. The tradition, healers traceable to pre-Inca cultures, recognized by UNESCO as part of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity, maintained a pharmacopoeia of approximately 980 species of medicinal plants. Among those plants was cinchona bark, which contains quinine. They used it for fever, for the recurrent chills that high-altitude communities were not immune to. When European missionaries and traders eventually encountered this knowledge, they brought cinchona back across the ocean, where it became the first effective treatment for malaria and shaped the entire history of European expansion into the tropics. But that is the future. Tonight, the sings his song in the lamplight, his voice low and steady, and the child breathes. The night is deep. The three worlds are very close together. Chapter 15. The Mountain Estate at Night. There is a place in these mountains that you know about, or think you know about, because its image has traveled across the world and into every mind that has ever looked at a photograph of somewhere extraordinary and thought, I want to be there. Built around 1450 CE, most likely commissioned by the great Inca, who expanded the empire dramatically during his reign, and who seems, from the archaeological evidence, to have had a particular interest in extraordinary building projects. The site sits on a narrow saddle between two mountain peaks, mountain and above the river gorge, at an altitude of about 2,400 meters, which is lower than Cuzco but still dramatically above the valley floor. What was this question is more complicated than it might appear. It was a royal retreat, that much seems fairly well established. It was a state, and after his death it would have been maintained by his. It was also an agricultural station. The extensive terracing on the surrounding slopes produced food, probably maize and quinoa, for the complex. It was a ceremonial center. There are shrines and stone a temple of the three windows, and other clearly sacred structures throughout the site, and it may have been an astronomical observatory. The Temple of the Sun's windows show alignments with the winter solstice sunrise that are unlikely to be accidental. At night is its own world. The site was never a large city. At any given time, the resident population was probably several hundred people, priests, administrative staff, servants, agricultural workers, not a metropolis, a compound, and at night the compound settled into a particular quality of stillness that the location generates almost without effort. The mountains around it are dark shapes, massive, present, alive in the sense that mountains were always alive in Andean cosmology. Rises almost vertically from the site's northern edge. On its summit, there was a small structure. The mountain itself was a mountain spirit, and you did not simply build on a mountain's summit casually. You built there because the building was an offering, an acknowledgement of the mountain's power. Tonight, mist is filling the valleys below. It comes up from the river, moving silently up the gorge walls, until the site is surrounded by a sea of white below the level of the terraces. The stone is cold to the touch. You feel it through whatever you are leaning against. The particular cold of stone that has been absorbing the air's temperature for hours, giving back what it stored in the day, and then going colder still. The stone, the post to which the sun is hitched, stands in the western sector of the site on a high point. It is a carved granite pillar, shaped by cutting away the surrounding rock until a pointed stone form remains attached to the bedrock below. It marked astronomical moments, the solstices, the equinoxes, zenith passage of the sun. Priests standing beside it could observe the shadow shortening and lengthening through the solar year, tracking Inti's movement through. At night it casts no shadow. It stands in the dark, stone among stone, cold and still. The stars above it are the same stars they were when engineers first placed it. The Milky Way arches from mountain peak to mountain peak. In one of the smaller structures near the agricultural terraces, a few of the resident workers are asleep. They came here for a season's work on the terraces, part of their obligation, and they will return home when the season ends. They sleep on their mats, wrapped in their blankets, tired from the work. Through the open doorway of the structure, there is no door hung in the frame, just the frame itself, cold air moving through. You can see the stars. The mist below has risen. It is now at the level of the lower terraces, lapping at the stone like slow water. You can watch it move if you stay still long enough. The mist does not rush. It has all night, and it behaves accordingly, rising in slow surges, retreating slightly, then rising again, exploring the terraces the way water explores the edges of a vessel, finding the low places first and then filling in until the entire lower section of the site has become something between land and cloud. The stone walls of the lower terraces are visible above it in places, dark horizontal lines emerging from white, and then the mist thickens and those lines disappear, and then it thins and they return. The site breathes. What is particular about this place at this hour, what is particular about in the hours after midnight when the workers are asleep, and the priests have finished their evening obligations, and the mist has filled the valley below, and the stars are clear overhead, is the quality of its isolation. Not the isolation of emptiness, the isolation of completeness. The site does not feel abandoned at this hour. It feels exactly as occupied as it needs to be. The mountains around it are awake in the way that mountains are always awake, enormously, patiently, without any particular concern for the small stone structures arranged on the saddle between them, but present nonetheless, exerting their presence the way great masses always exert their presence, as a kind of gravity, a sense of weight in the peripheral awareness. The stone stands in the dark. Cold to the touch, you could put your hand on it right now, and the cold would move through your palm immediately. The stone stored cold deeper and more patient than the air's cold. This particular stone has been here since the engineers first cut it from the bedrock. A deliberate act, a decision to make this specific raised point into an instrument, into a reference mark for observing the sun's path across the year. On the equinox, the sun reaches its zenith directly above it, and the stone casts no shadow at all. And that absence of shadow was itself meaningful, was itself something observed and recorded and understood within a framework of solar time that the priests maintained with extraordinary care. But tonight, there is no sun, there is no shadow. The stone simply stands in the dark, present and ancient and cold, the mist drifting across the terrace below it, and occasionally sending a thin tendril of cloud up over the level of the stone itself, before it dissipates in the drier air above. In one of the smaller structures near the agricultural terraces, a few of the resident workers are asleep. They came here for a season's work on the terraces, part of their obligation, and they will return home when the season ends. They sleep on their mats, wrapped in their blankets, tired from the work. Through the open doorway of the structure, there is no door hung in the frame, just the frame itself, cold air moving through, you can see the stars. The mist below has risen. It is now at the level of the lower terraces, lapping at the stone like slow water. The sight is very still, the kind of stillness that has mass that you can lean against. The kind of stillness that this particular place seems to generate from some internal source, as if the mountains agreed long ago to keep it this way, to protect this particular quality of silence at this particular hour on this particular saddle between peaks. No wind, no sound from the river, the gorge below is too deep, and the mist too thick to carry the water's sound up to where you are standing. Only the faint, collective breath of sleeping people in stone rooms, and above that, the stars, and above the stars, nothing at all the way out. Chapter 16. The highest sacrifice. There are some things in this world that are very difficult to speak of calmly, not because the facts are disputed, they are not, or not much, not at the core, but because the facts describe something that sits at the boundary of what the human mind can process without either retreating into clinical detachment or sliding into the wrong kind of horror. There was a state ritual. It was not frequent. It was not a characteristic of everyday Inca life. It was performed at specific moments of crisis or significance. The death of an Inca, a major military crisis, a severe natural disaster, the illness of a ruler. It required the sacrifice of children and young women, typically children who were of particular beauty or health or social significance, selected from across the empire with what appears to have been both care and ritual preparation. We know about from Spanish colonial accounts, which must be treated with some caution, since the Spanish had political and religious incentives to describe Inca practices in ways that justified their conquest. But we also know about it from archaeology. In 1999, and led an expedition to the summit of in Argentina, a volcano that reaches 6,739 meters, among the highest in the Western Hemisphere. Near the summit, they found 3 children. The cold and altitude had preserved them extraordinarily, better than almost any other ancient remains in the world. They are now known as the children of a girl of about 6, a boy of about 7, and a girl of 13 or 14. She is sometimes called the maiden, sometimes the lady of the volcano. They were placed in their tombs with objects, fine textiles, ceramic vessels, small carved figurines of silver and gold. They were dressed in fine clothes. They were arranged in seated positions. They had been there for roughly 500 years. In 2013, a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences analyzed hair samples from the children of using isotope analysis. The results showed a clear and deliberate escalation in the consumption of coca and alcohol, specifically in the months and weeks leading up to the sacrifice. The older girl showed the most dramatic escalation, suggesting she was the primary focus of the ritual and may have been given increasing amounts of these substances as the ceremony approached. Chewed coca leaves were found inside one mummy's mouth. The isotope record in the hair could be read like a timeline, the weeks of preparation written in the chemistry of the body. What do we make of this? The Inca believed, in a way that was internally coherent and consistent with their entire cosmological framework, that death was not an ending, that the children were not destroyed but elevated, that they became intercessors, holy presences at the summit of a mountain that was itself a sacred, and that their presence there made the mountain more powerful, or satisfied the mountain, or called down protection on the empire. The escalation of coca and may have been meant to ease the children's passage, to make the final stage of the journey peaceful. We cannot know for certain what the children experienced. We cannot know whether they understood what was happening, or whether the substances they were given ensured that they did not. A 2026 study using CT scanning has identified the first clear evidence of deliberate mummification techniques in at least one victim, suggesting that the post-treatment of the body was part of the ritual and intentional creation of a permanent, sacred physical presence. It would be wrong to pretend this does not disturb us. It would also be wrong to use this disturbance as an excuse to reduce the Inca to a single image of barbarity, which is what colonial accounts wanted to do, and which the full picture of Inca civilization does not support. These were a people who built extraordinary roads, who fed millions of people from a state storage system that worked, who developed the most sophisticated textile tradition in the Americas, who read the dark sky and found llamas in the shadows. They were also a people who, at the moments of greatest need, sent their children to the mountaintops. We do not have to resolve this tension. We only have to acknowledge it and hold it and continue. Let us do that for a moment. Simply hold it. The summit of at night, if you allow yourself to imagine it, though it is not comfortable to do so, is a place of extraordinary stillness and extraordinary cold. 6,700 meters. The air at that altitude contains roughly half the oxygen present at sea level. No fire burns there. No sound travels far. The wind across the summit in the Andean winter drops the temperature so far below freezing that exposed skin lasts minutes before permanent damage begins. And in the cold and the darkness, 500 years ago, the children who had been carried there in procession, wrapped in their finest clothes, accompanied by priests who believed genuinely and completely in the sanctity of what they were doing. Those children were placed in their prepared chambers, and the world above them continued turning. What the isotope study from 2013 tells us, and this is worth sitting with quietly, not with horror, but with the kind of sustained attention that the fact deserves, is that the older girl, the one the researchers sometimes call the maiden, had coca and alcohol in her system in concentrations that increased dramatically in the weeks before the end. The chemistry of her hair recorded this, the way a tree records a drought in its rings. The last months of her life, written in the physical record of her body, visible to scientists half a millennium later. Whether this was mercy or ritual protocol or both simultaneously is not something we can know from the inside. We can only know the fact of it, which is that someone who understood what was coming made a decision about how she would experience it. The children of are now in a museum in Salta, Argentina. They are studied. They are photographed. They are, in some very real sense, still present, not as the Inca intended them to be present, not as mountain ancestors communing with the living empire, but present nonetheless. More visible, arguably, than almost any other individual from the pre-Columbian Americas. More carefully examined. More known in specific physical ways than the vast majority of people who lived and died in the 1500s anywhere on Earth. They are also simply children, small, cold, still. They were also a people who, at the moments of greatest need, sent their children to the mountaintops. We do not have to resolve this tension. We only have to acknowledge it and hold it and continue. Chapter 17. Dawn approaches, the living empire. The sky to the east is not yet light, not quite, but it has changed. You have been watching it for some time now, watching the darkness in that direction, the ridge of the mountains against the stars, and somewhere in the last few minutes, a change has happened that is more felt than seen. The absolute darkness has given way to something slightly less absolute, not color yet, not the first pink or orange of dawn. Something earlier than that, a qualitative shift in the darkness itself, as if the sky has stopped insisting on its depth and begun, very quietly, to reconsider. This is the hour before the hour. In the village on the Altiplano, the woman who has been awake since the second watch of the night, her body trained to wake, because she has a nursing child, nurses the child in the darkness, and listens to the quality of the air outside the stone walls. She has been doing this for long enough that she knows this hour by feel, the particular cold, the particular quality of the silence. This is the cold before the warmth. This is the silence before the first bird. The runner who received the relay message 2 hours ago and ran his leg through the mountain night has reached his destination Tambo and handed off to the next runner. He is now inside, next to the fire, his blanket around his shoulders, eating a piece of dried camelid from the Tambo's stores. His breathing is returning to normal, the deep, even breathing of someone who has just done something demanding and is now very willingly still. He will sleep for a few hours before his rotation comes again. In Cusco, The woman who has been watching the sacred fire through the night shift is sitting very still. The fire is fine. It has always been fine. She is perhaps a little drowsy. The long watch hours have their effect even on the most vigilant, but she is not sleeping. Her eyes are still on the flame. In her lap, the weaving she was working on 3 hours ago is somewhat further along than it was. The pattern has grown, a section of the geometric border, red on dark, the angular repeat that is the signature of her particular weaving tradition. On the hillside above the village, the potatoes have completed another freeze cycle. The temperature is at its lowest now, the hour before dawn always the coldest, and the potatoes are as frozen as they will get. When the sun comes up and the day workers come up the hill, the next cycle of treading and drying will begin. In the above the valley, the stores of last year's sit in orderly darkness. Enough food here to feed the community through a lean year. The state's promise kept, in physical form, stone, wood, dried potato. The Inca, wherever he is sleeping tonight, in whichever of his palaces, attended by his wives and servants and guards, will soon be woken by the first light falling through his window. His palace, like the, was oriented to receive the sun's first light. The moment of waking for the emperor was a ritual moment. Priests would be present. The first words and actions of the day had their ceremonial quality. But that is minutes away, perhaps half an hour. For now he sleeps. The from the headman's house is also awake early. He has a new accounting to prepare, a record of the work completed on the section of road that has been assigned for this season's obligation. He works in the pre-dawn quiet, his fingers moving through the strings by touch as much as sight, tying and retying, adding subsidiary chords. The completed section of the accounting will be sent, via the relay, to the provincial administrator, who will add it to a larger quipu that summarizes the district's output. The whole empire is waking this way, not all at once, but region by region, altitude by altitude, the higher settlements entering the cold pre-dawn, while the coastal settlements have already had an hour of gray light. Everywhere the same basic rhythms, fire tended, children woken and wrapped in blankets, the first tasks of the day begun in the last of the dark. The priests in Cuzco are already beginning their morning circuits. The incense is being lit in the courtyard. The who will carry the morning offering to the stone is preparing herself, wrapping her finest cloth around her shoulders, taking up the small ceramic vessel of that will be the morning's libation. The sky to the east has changed again. Now there is color, the first trace of it, the faintest orange above the mountain rim, still barely distinguishable from the purple of the night sky, but there. Inti is coming. And in the land of the four quarters, in the empire that organized itself around the sun, that built its temples to receive the first light, that measured its calendar by the sun's path through the sky, this is not metaphor. This is the most important moment of every day. The sun is returning. The promise is being kept. Chapter 18. This morning, what remains? Let us stay a little longer before the full dawn. In a moment, the sky will be too bright to hold this feeling. In a moment, the birds will start and the dogs will bark and the fire will be lit and the day will begin and everything will be practical and ordinary and busy in the way that days always become. But right now, in these last few minutes of true darkness, there is something worth holding, something that belongs to the night and not to the day. The will wake soon. the farmers and herders and weavers and runners and priests, and will rise and wash their faces in the cold water from the pot left overnight, and wrap themselves more tightly in their blankets against the pre-dawn chill, and begin the day. They will do the things that needed to be done yesterday, and the things that need to be done today, and most of those things will be the same. The terraces need tending. The llamas need herding up to the higher pasture. The weaving needs to be advanced by another row, and then the piece will be done, and another piece begun. The road section needs to be finished before the imperial inspectors make their circuit. This is not a life without hardship. Altitude is not gentle. The cold at night on the Altiplano is not comfortable by any modern standard of comfort. The average Andean highland farmer in the 15th century was working very hard, at altitude, on a diet that was nutritious but not luxurious, in a system of obligations that gave him limited control over how he spent his own time. The labor tax was real, and its demands were real. The authority of the state, the Inca, his provincial administrators, his inspectors who traveled the lines and counted the quippus and assessed compliance, was pervasive and not optional. And yet, there were also things that this life contained which are harder to quantify, harder to put on one side of a scale against the hardships and get a clear answer. The itself, the network of mutual obligation, of shared labor, of the knowledge that the people around you were bound to help you the way you were bound to help them, was a form of social security that many modern people, in their relative material wealth, would find enviable. You would not starve alone. If your crop failed and your neighbors did not, the principle obligated your neighbor to help you. If you were sick and could not work your field, others worked it for you, and the debt was recorded not in money, but in the expectation that you would do the same when you were able. You would not rethatch your house alone. You would not grieve alone. The communal life of the created a texture of belonging, genuine, practical, daily belonging. That was something the Inca system, whatever its other costs, genuinely provided. The landscape was alive in a way that was not merely poetic or metaphorical. The mountain above the village had a name. It had a personality and a history, in the sense that had accumulated stories about it over generations. Times when it had been generous, times when its patience had been tested, the specific offerings it preferred, the dreams in which it appeared, and what those dreams had preceded. The spring below had a name. The river in the valley had a name. Every significant rock and prominent tree and place where lightning had struck had its status in the local geography of the sacred. You did not live in an anonymous landscape of inert matter. You lived in a world dense with named presences, presences with personalities, presences that could be communicated with and that communicated back. The sky above, the sacred river, was not empty space with decorative lights. It was a mirror of the earth, alive with the dark shapes of animals, turning slowly through the year in a cycle as reliable as the river in the valley, as reliable as the seasons. Looking up was the same act as looking around you, the same world, differently oriented, and the dead were not gone. They were here in the mummies in their palatial rooms in Cuzco, in the remembered ancestors in this collective memory, in the prayers spoken on the ridge above the fields, in the libation poured on the earth before the first drink of. The present and the past were not the two sides of a wall. They were the two sides of a conversation, still ongoing, still meaningful. The sky is changing. The last of the true dark is lifting, not into light yet, but into something between, a deep blue at the zenith, fading to a slightly less deep blue toward the east, where the mountains are becoming visible as shapes rather than as pure darkness. You can see the terracing now, barely, the horizontal lines of the field walls cutting across the hillside, each terrace a testament to this collective labor over generations, each wall built and rebuilt by hands working together because no pair of hands could have built it alone. The built these mountains, or rather, the built this particular face of these particular mountains into something livable, into something that could feed people and shelter animals and hold water against the dry months. That is what the terraces are, not a scenic feature, but an achievement. The conversion of near-vertical Andean slopes into productive agricultural land by centuries of accumulated community effort. And soon, when the sun rises, people will come out of their houses and go back to those terraces and tend them again. Closing, fades, the Milky Way is moving toward the western horizon. It moves, of course, the way everything in the sky moves, the slow rotation of the Earth carrying us under it, carrying the dark patch that is the llama from her high position above the center of the sky toward the mountains in the west, where she will dip below thee and be gone until tomorrow night. Somewhere in the next few minutes, perhaps 10, perhaps 15, the sky will be too bright for the Milky Way. The stars will still be there, but they will be invisible, washed out by the sun's approaching light. And the dark constellations, the shapes made of shadow in the river of light, will disappear first, because darkness is always the first thing to go when the light comes. Is sinking now. Her body, that great dark bulk in the Milky Way, is near the horizon. Her eyes, alpha and beta, still visible, very bright, burning steadily in the last of the true night. The fox is gone. The toad has already set. But the llama remains for a few minutes more, drinking from the sacred river, as she has drunk since long before anyone was watching. The world this video has passed through tonight, this empire, this night, these people ended. Not gradually, not comfortably. The ships arrived in 1532. The Inca was captured, ransomed, and executed. The empire crumbled under the weight of Spanish military force, and far more devastatingly, the European diseases that the indigenous population had no immunity to. The gold of the was melted down and shipped across the ocean. The lines were built over with churches and streets. The who knew how to read the knotted strings were scattered or killed, and the knowledge of the Quipu was largely lost. But the Quechua language is spoken today by approximately 10 million people across the Andes. Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Argentina, Colombia, everywhere the Nan once ran, people still speak the language in which the Inca told their stories and gave their commands and named their sacred animals in the sky. Children still pour a few drops of on the earth before they drink, for the first cup always for. Communities still practice forms of the mutual labor exchange that built the terraces and thatched the roofs. The dark constellations are still taught by grandparents in the highlands to lying on their backs in the cold, clear night. What the Inca built, the roads, the terraces, the stone walls that survived the earthquakes, some of it is still there, some of it is still in use. The terraces above and are still being farmed. Some of the stone channels that the Inca used to irrigate their fields still carry water. The mountain passes that they ran through on stone roads are still mountain passes, still cold, still clear, still with the wind moving through them. The Milky Way is the same Milky Way. I want to say that to you directly. The sky that the Inca priests watched from the courtyard, the sky that a young looked up at when he paused in the doorway of his tambo on a clear mountain night, the sky that the woman at the sacred fire glimpsed through the narrow gap in the compound wall. It is the same sky that is above you right now, wherever you are. The same stars. The llama still drinking from the sacred river, in exactly the same place in the Milky Way, her eyes still alpha and beta. If you are in a place where you can see the night sky and the season is right, you might be able to find her, not a constellation of bright dots, a shape made of darkness, a llama-shaped absence in the river of light, drinking from the edge of the stream. Let your eyes soften. Let them look not for the stars, but for the space between them. The sky quiets. The empire rests. The last light of touches the western mountains and is gone. We are in a village of stone houses with thatch roofs, at 4,000 meters, with the cold pressing gently against the walls and the fire in the hearth tended down to its last warm coals, and two children breathing slowly in the dark. The air here is thin, thin enough that breath is slightly sweet, slightly different than it is at sea level, as if the altitude has distilled something out of it. Each breath is just a little more deliberate. Each breath is just a little more present. There is nothing you need to do right now. There is nowhere you need to be. The stone walls of this room, thick, carefully placed, fitted together without mortar, because the Inca knew how to make stone grip stone, are holding the temperature steady, the warmth they absorbed in the day slowly releasing through the night. You have been here long enough that the room has settled around you. The smoke smell has become something you no longer consciously notice. The sound of the in the corner has become part of the room's texture, like the sound of the wind, like the sound of another person sleeping. Outside, nothing is moving. The road is empty. They have passed. The llama caravan is somewhere further south along the Nan, its lead llama's bells faintly audible and then not audible at all. The on the ridge above the village is quiet in the dark, just a stone and a spring, the music finished hours ago. The quipu in its niche holds its knots. The on the hillside holds its freeze. The fire holds its warmth. And the sky above all of it, above the village and the road and the snow-capped peaks and the stone saddle of in its mist, holds its darkness and its river of light and its dark animals and its extraordinary, patient, ancient silence. Sleep well. The empire is at rest. The rustle once softly in the corner. The fire breathes. The stone holds. The sacred river fades in the west, and the eastern sky, though you cannot see it yet, is already beginning to remember the light. End of script. 14 Inca Nights.